Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm back with another video of language learning advice. In the past, we've talked about grammatical peculiarities to be aware of when learning a language, and we've talked about discrete differences in vocab. This time, we'll be talking about turns of phrase that you'll need to know how to say in your target language. It's not the flashiest topic ever, but if you know these, your competence in your target language will go through the roof because many learners focus too much on vocab and core grammar, completely overlooking turns of phrase, and when they need to use them, they're a bit lost. And if you're not quite sure what I mean by turns of phrase, don't worry, you'll figure it out as I go through some examples. Let's go! Alright, so the first turn of phrase is it makes me blank. Blank could be standing in for either an adjective or a verb, and some languages treat those differently. Now, oftentimes you could probably get away with directly translating the phrase, like in Spanish, where it makes me happy is me hace feliz, and it makes me glow is me hace brillar, both direct translations. But in Hebrew, this would only work on the version with an adjective. It makes me happy is ze ose oti sameach, but for the verb, ze ose oti lizroach is not a thing. Instead, Hebrew has a verb specifically for this purpose, ligrom, so it makes me glow in Hebrew is ze gorem li lizroach. It basically translates to cause, and you'll see it everywhere in the language. I learned the word purely through exposure, no bookwork needed. But now some of y'all may be thinking about the causative operation expressed in Hebrew by class 4. Well, that doesn't really work for this purpose. The causative creates entirely new verbs, so if you were to say ze mazliach oti, that would mean more like it lights me up, and also it would sound a bit poetic. But there are some languages that do this in earnest. Hungarian, for example, has a suffix for this purpose, tot or tet, depending on vowel harmony with the root. So in Hungarian, it makes me glow would be rojotatingem. But it gets better because Hungarian also has a suffix you'd put on an adjective to turn it into a verb, meaning make something that adjective. Eat. Therefore, it makes me happy is boldogitengem. And then once you've mastered that concept in your target language, you can do more things with it, like putting the verb in a different tense or changing the subject or object, all of which will apply throughout this video. We'll continue on this theme with a similar topic, let me and let's phrases. For let me phrases, once again, you can sometimes translate fairly directly, like in Spanish where let me see is déjame ver. Hebrew basically does the same thing, but instead the verb used is actually give. That sentence in Hebrew is therefore ten li lirot, which would literally translate to give me to see. And then there's the interesting example of Telugu, where you put the extra suffix anivu onto the verb to indicate the meaning of let blank do the thing. So in Telugu, see is churu, but let me see is nan. So now about let's. That construction we have in English is extremely Germanic in nature. All the Germanic languages I've studied use it, except for Icelandic, which uses the subjunctive mood, so let's see is sjavim. This is actually pretty close to the system used by Romance and Slavic languages. They all use a first-person plural conjugation of the imperative mood, so let's see in French is voyons, and in Polish it's zobaczmy. And Telugu also has a suffix for this, dam, so let's see is chudam. Next up, we have another thing to put verbs in the context of, that being keep doing something. And this is a place where even if you only speak English, you can tell that our way is a bit weird, like keep doing something, it's just continue. And while you probably could get away with just using the word continue in your target language, a lot of languages have a more common way to express this idea. For example, Spanish and other Romance languages would say that you should follow doing something. So in Spanish, keep swimming is sigue nadando. And then of course Telugu has a verbal suffix for this, tu ne undu, so that sentence in Telugu is idu tu ne undu. After that, we'll talk about in order to phrases when you use a verb to describe your end goal of doing something else. Of course in English we could just say to do that thing, but you may use in order to make that even more clear. This shouldn't be too hard. Normally you just add some word or phrase before an infinitive verb. So like in Spanish, in order to see is para ver, with para meaning for, and in Hebrew it's kde lirot, with kde basically just being a particle for that purpose. Then there's Arabic, which doesn't have infinitive verbs. They'd construct those sentences as for the verbal noun, so in order to see is lil meshahede, or for the seeing. And similarly for Telugu, I actually explicitly mentioned in that language overview how they handle this situation. They put the verbal noun in the dative case, so in order to see in Telugu is churataniki, the key suffix being dative. Alright, now let's talk about phrases like it's me or it's you, and some of y'all already know where I'm going with this. In some languages like English, the verb is third person, it is me, it is you. But in the Romance languages, the verb's personal agreement would match with me or you. So in Spanish, it's me is soy yo, which literally translates as either I am me or it am I, depending on your willingness to perceive an unsaid it pronoun there, which is totally feasible in a language like Spanish. Same with Italian sono yo, but French breaks this as when they need a standalone pronoun, they do the same thing English does and use the object pronoun, so in French that sentence would be c'est moi, with a third person verb. So I guess that's a bit of a bonus turn of phrase to be aware of. It's also worth noting that this question is completely irrelevant in a lot of languages that delete the verb be in present tense. The next topic to talk about is how to use an interrogative pronoun as a conjunction because some languages have special rules for forming such phrases. I'm talking about sentences like, it's what you do, or this is how I bake cookies. They're not questions, but they use a question word as a conjunction. In English, you'd pretty much just add it straight on. The only difference between these sentences and a question is that questions will either flip the subject and verb or require do support, and the interrogative pronoun conjunctive phrases don't do that. So like, what am I eating versus it's what I am eating. But in Spanish, at least for what, you have to add the pronoun lo before que. Those above two sentences in Spanish are que estoy comiendo and es lo que estoy comiendo. You may also notice that the que lost its acute. That's because it actually means that or which as a conjunction, but you can probably guess where it came from. Also, technically the word lo would have to agree for gender and number, so es la que estoy comiendo is also possible, but you'll mostly hear lo, especially in situations where the referent noun is either too abstract or otherwise poorly defined in the conversation. You may also find what Hebrew does in your target language, which is pretty chill. You just add the conjunction she, meaning that, between the pronoun and the subordinate clause. So our sentences in Hebrew are mani ochel and ze ma she ani ochel. And Telugu has an alternative verbal suffix to account for this, lang o, but it's a bit more complicated there since the main clause verb can't be a conjugation of be for this to work. So I'll reuse the example from the Telugu language overview. I see how he does it. Ila chestaro chustanu. Now I'll talk a bit about expressing age. Of course, there is the caveat that in most languages you can informally refer to an age with just the number given the context, but for full phrases, different languages have different perspectives on what being a certain age actually means. English does the Germanic thing of using years to quantify someone's degree of oldness with the question, how old are you? And the response, I'm number years old. But the Romance languages, among some others, think of age as having years. I'll switch it up and use Romanian. The question is, câți ani ai? Literally, how many years do you have? And the response is am număr de ani. I have number years. The Slavic languages I'm familiar with are divided on the issue. Polish and Serbian do basically what the Romance languages do, while Russian and Czech slightly change it so that the person with the age is in the dative case. So in Russian, the question is сколько тебе лет? And the response is мне номер лет. Number years are to me. And then finally, Hebrew gets a bit creative and thinks of age as being a son or daughter of the number of years. So the question is ben kamata or bat kamat, literally how many years implied are you a son or daughter of? And the response is ani ben o bat mispar shanim, meaning I'm a son or daughter of number years. And for the final section, we'll talk about some manners, but specifically one very big mistake beginners at language learning do that kind of pisses me off. If you're trying to figure out how to respond to thank you in your target language, don't look up how to say you're welcome. Especially if you're using some internet translating software, it'll likely give you a direct translation that is not an appropriate response to thank you. Also, a bit of a side note for non-native English speakers, these days at least in America, younger people prefer to instead respond to thank you with no problem due to changing cultural perceptions. But yeah, I have literally been messaging in Hebrew before, said toda, thank you in Hebrew, and gotten a response of bruchim habayim. There's just so much wrong with that. And just to be clear, this advice is relevant regardless of your native language, so what should you search instead? Search response to thank you. That's likely how an internet resource will word the phrase you're looking for. For example, what my friend should have said in Hebrew was bevakasha, which literally means of request, as in you asked for it, so I did it, and it's also a term for please. Interestingly, Slavic languages in general also use their word for please as the response to thank you, with Russian pожалуйста, Polish proszę, Serbian molim, and Czech prosim. Italian follows a similar logic with prego, which means I pray or I beg, not unlike the literal translation of most of the Slavic words above. The other Romance languages do it a bit differently though. In the West, they say of nothing, as in no need to thank me, my good deed was not a burden, which is the same idea behind no problem. We've got Spanish de nada, Portuguese de nada, and French de rien. Romanian has the same basic idea with cu plăcere, meaning with pleasure. But the weirdest response I know of is Arabic. They say afwan, which basically means excuse me? Like, oh my bad, didn't mean to help you out there. Dang. So yeah, those were various turns of phrase that you'll need to become familiar with so you don't sound extremely weird in your target language. But how will you end up coming across those features so you'll know to look for them? This is one of the many things that translation practice, or realistically any type of production practice, is great for. If you need to write out sentences in your target language, you'll inevitably come across these phrases and be like, guess I should figure out how my target language navigates that. I have a group of 50 songs in English that I translate to all my target languages, for example, and in order to write the script for this video, I literally just looked through my translated songs for turns of phrase that always catch me off guard when I translate them and made a list. This is super fitting as well because coming across those turns of phrase originally is what gave me the idea for this video, so be sure to do something like that when you learn languages. Thanks for watching!